Welcome to Agape Ministries podcasts, a whole new way of thinking. Episode 7, John Shea's marvellous teaching on how to understand the spiritual wisdom of the Gospels.
Thank you. You know everything about me. Well beyond the introductions. It's really good to be here with you to talk about the spiritual wisdom of the Gospels, and we have 2 days to do it, and we're the right size group to make sure that whatever you came to hear and work with, we have a chance to do that. So I want to make sure by the time people return tomorrow that whatever they came to get, they did get, and so we'll try to work that out, okay, a bit. I'd like to tell you a little bit in this first session about how I came to sort of begin to look at the gospel stories this way, and out of that we can sort of get a sense of this type of approach to the gospels of spiritual wisdom and work from it there. And then as Michael mentioned, there'll be work in small groups for those who want it, and we'll develop things as we go along. I started to get interested in telling stories from other spiritual traditions. Native American traditions, Sufi traditions, Hindu traditions, Buddhist traditions. And the more I got into those stories and learned to tell them, the more something happened with the stories that I had grown up with, the stories that I meditated on since I was 13, the stories that I thought told me the truth about the relationship to God and the creation and all other people, the ones I continually consulted, they began to look a little different to me. One of the stories I bumped into, and I don't even know what tradition this comes from, is from the Hindu tradition. The story has been called What's the World Like? It just starts out, God and a man are walking down a road. The man says to God, what's the world like? God said, I'd love to tell you, but my throat is parched. If you could get me a cup of cold water, I could drink the water, slake my thirst, I'll tell you what the world's like. The man says, don't go anywhere. He left him immediately, went into a neighboring village, knocked upon a door. A very comely young woman opened the door. He said, do you have a cup of cold water? She said, yes, I do, but it's midday. Would you care for some food? He said, yes, I would. 30 years later, they have 5 children. She is a respected member of the community. He is a well-known merchant. A hurricane comes, uproots their village. In the middle of it, the man cries out, help me, God! A voice in the middle of the hurricane said, where's my cup of cold water? What is the world like? It's a place of forgetfulness. That was the theme. That's what it's like. You forget in the world. See? But then people say, that's an interesting story. Tell us a gospel story. And although I knew the gospel stories and the tradition much better than these, there was something in me that always hesitated. See? And the reason it took me a while to figure out why I hesitated to tell a gospel story, like I just told you that little story, or other stories from the Jewish tradition. I just hesitated. And then it finally dawned on me one day why I hesitated. The gospel stories, in the way I was doing them, don't give the listener the same type of chance at what they're saying than other stories from other traditions. The gospel stories are incredibly succinct, incredibly intricate. They're like little cameos in ivory, etched perfectly, line by line by line. And they don't give themselves away to one hearing. They don't give themselves away to one throw at the ears. Okay? Jesus was walking along the borders of Tyre and Sidon. Behold, a woman living in those borders, coming forward, crying out, saying, Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me, a sinner. My daughter is terribly troubled by a demon. He gave her no word of response. His disciples came up to him saying, get rid of her. She keeps crying and shouting after us. Jesus replied, my mission is to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And she came forward, doing him homage, saying, help me, Lord. It is not right, said Jesus, to take the food that is meant for the children and throw it to the dogs. Yes, Lord, she said, but even the dogs eat the scraps that fall from the children's table. Oh, woman, said Jesus, great is your faith. Let it be done as you desire. That very moment, her daughter got better. See the difference in the stories? I'm going to talk as a storyteller for a while. So succinct. Even if I slowed down, so fast. The dialogue, lightning exchanges, the surface of words, betraying inner consciousness of people, the difficulty of tracing the surface fireworks of the word down into the consciousness of the characters that are going back and forth. See? And so I began to think it's really hard, and this is across the board, to tell gospel stories to the ear, or to tell them once to the ear, for they don't seem to give themselves away. They seem to need something more about them to get into them and understand them. See? And then I was trying, because it was the Christmas season, to learn how to tell the infancy narrative from the Gospel of Luke. And I was having trouble with one of the characters. So storytellers talk in terms of characters. The character I was having trouble with was the Angel Gabriel. He seemed to be an inconsistent character. Luke, as a storyteller, paints very quickly dramatic portraits, you see. And the problem with Gabriel is he seems to treat Zachary a great deal differently than he treats Mary, and yet the two stories are obviously held together in some ways. Luke quickly paints this magnificent picture. Everybody outside the temple, in temple courtyards, is praying. Inside, in the Holy of Holies, is Zachary, the high priest for the year, next to the altar of incense. And behold, an angel shows up at the right hand of the altar of incense. First thing he says is, do not be afraid. Madeline Engel always said, you ever notice in the Bible, whenever angels show up, they say, do not be afraid? It gives you some idea what they look like. Do not be afraid. Your prayers have been answered. Well, this sounds like good news to me. And then he gives them the birth announcement of John the Baptist. This kid is going to be something else again. But at the end of it, Zachary has this line to say, how shall I know this? I am old. My wife is beyond childbearing years. To which Gabriel says, I'm Gabriel. I stand before the throne of God. I've been sent here to tell you this good news, and since you have not believed it, you will be silent till everything I have said has come to pass. I thought this was a bit huffy. I mean, it seemed like he asked a perfectly normal question. How will I know this? I am old. My wife is beyond childbearing years. And he gets blown away by the credentials of Gabriel. This guy stands before the throne of God. He's just been sent here. What are you? Chopped liver, you know. Now this problem with the angel Gabriel gets a little worse when he shows up at Mary, because Mary says something that sounds remarkably like what Gabriel says. She says, how shall I know that? How shall this come to be? I know not man. That sounds remarkably like it. Does our Blessed Mother get silenced? No. She gets an explanation, you know. It is a mystical explanation. The power of the Most High will come upon you. The Holy Spirit will overshadow you. The one that will be born of you will be called Holy, the Son of God. It's a mystical explanation, but she gets one. And so my question as a storyteller for the consistency of the character became, did Gabriel have a bad hair day with Zachary, and was he just kinder? Where is the consistency of the character? Why the difference? See? So I was looking at it from a literary point of view, from a storytelling point of view. And of course, it's the second set of exchanges between Mary and Gabriel. The first set are quite simple. After the setup line, Gabriel says to Mary, Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with you, or Hail, highly favored one, the Lord is with you, or in Greek it's kare komene. You can almost hear it. It's loving. There's something powerful and loving. You're full of grace. The Lord is with you. You're on some type of mission. It's the response the storyteller puts in that got me thinking. Mary was troubled by this greeting, but pondered it in her mind what it might mean. She didn't get what he said. She heard what he said, but she didn't understand it. She was troubled by it. She had to ponder it in her mind, what it might mean. And this is the beginning in Luke of the pondering themes to deepen the question of faith, because Mary in Luke's gospel, as the scholars tell us, is not only the mother of Jesus, she's also the perfect disciple, and she's a ponderer. She manages to pull things deep inside herself. She ponders the birth of Jesus. All were astonished when the shepherds told them, except one, Mary. She pondered all these things in her heart. When she goes back to Nazareth, she is characterized as someone who held all these things in her heart. She's someone who can do a lot of interior realization. She pondered it. Why was she so troubled by the greeting? Because it's such an odd way to greet somebody. It's an odd way to salute somebody. Usually you might salute them by their family status or their occupation. But to go up and greet someone and salute them as someone who is filled with grace, and in Luke, grace is an inner power to respond in a way that is not dictated by outer circumstances. You have a power inside yourself to do good in the face of evil. You have a power inside yourself to bless those who persecute you. You have a power inside yourself to pray for those who torment you. There's something stronger on the inside of the person than there is in the outer circumstances that prevail. And you've got this power. And he was saying, this is what you are. You're filled with this transcendent power of response, and that puts you on a mission from God. And she didn't get that. She didn't get that. She had to ponder it. See? Because that's a spiritual take. That's spiritual wisdom. That's a spiritual approach to a person. It doesn't concentrate on their physical identities. It doesn't concentrate on their social identities. It names some type of inner spiritual capacity that a person has and directly addresses it, goes right at it, bang. And it's very puzzling when that happens to us. Even today, it's very puzzling when we introduced each other and saw a face and knew that we wouldn't bite each other. Why? Because we think we do bite each other. We wouldn't bite each other. And you talk to someone, you probably found out where they were from, their geography. See? But in the gospel, there's only one truth about every person. It's only one way to greet each person. You know, you're full of grace, but you don't know it. See? And because you don't know it, you're troubled by this greeting. See? And the only way you will ever know it is if you consider it in your mind, if you ponder it. That's why I had so much trouble with the stories. See? That's why I had so much trouble. The stories, you don't catch them on first run. They're not like stories from other traditions. They're stories about spiritual consciousness, and spiritual consciousness is always a difficult consciousness, because most of the time, as the story, What is the World Like, is about, our consciousness is pretty well confined to physical and social reality. And then if we meditate a lot, we learn that we can become conscious of our mental realities. We can watch our own thoughts and feelings, become very self-aware in that process. But even if you become conscious of mental activities, the deeper level of consciousness, spiritual consciousness, is very, very difficult to get at. And I began to think, what are these stories about? Is every text in the Gospels a story, an instruction, a lesson, an opening about spiritual consciousness? Is it about spiritual wisdom? And is what we're doing with these stories is we're about opening our consciousness into a deeper level to understand the spiritual dynamics of our lives which permeate and flow through our physical and social realities, but which are exceedingly difficult to spot. Lao Tzu, a Confucius teacher, said about the spiritual, he said, the spirit of the fountain, much like Jesus talked about it with the woman at Samaria. It's funny, you go into it like it's a well and think you have to draw things out with your own effort. But once you're inside, the well turns into a fountain and it springs up by itself. This is strange types of inner consciousness experiences. Lao Tzu said, the spirit of the fountain dies not, lingering like gossamer. It barely hints at existence, lingering like gossamer. It's barely there, the spiritual dimension of our lives. It doesn't make the impact of arthritis. It doesn't do the same thing to your emotional lives as when you lose your job. These are the things that kick us. These wake us up. When you can't move your joints, your consciousness is totally collapsed around pain. When you lose your job, your consciousness is totally collapsed around your vulnerability and embarrassment. And it really makes an impact. The spiritual dimension is subtle. It lingers like gossamer. It barely hints at existence. It's a very subtle level of who we are and what we're about. But Lao Tzu says, when you learn to draw on it, it's inexhaustible. Okay? Everything else is completely scarce. Everything else is very vulnerable. Spiritual dimension is not like that at all. It's inexhaustible when you draw on it. See? But how to draw on it, how to allow consciousness to expand from physical and social and even mental worlds to touch on spirit and dip into that well and allow that spirit to enter into physical life to give it vitality and enter into social life to give it direction. See? How do you do that? See? And are all these texts in the Gospels, I was beginning to think, are these texts instructions to consciousness to tap into the spiritual dimensions of our lives? And so I went back to Zachary, our silenced one, and I said, am I really reading this right? Here's what he asked, is how shall I know this? Okay? What's the path of knowing? How shall I know this? Okay? And Gabriel says to him, I'm Gabriel. I stand before the throne of God. Okay? How do you know the spiritual dimension of the world? I've been sent here to tell you this good news. This is very, 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 very good news. Okay? I've been sent here to tell you this. But since you cannot grasp it, just like Mary, since you cannot grasp it, you will have to be silent. Be still, we just prayed. Be still, we just prayed. And know the Lord is here. In other words, it doesn't necessarily mean straight silence. It means you're going to have to move away from the consciousness of physical and social reality, only to return to it. But the spiritual dimension is a little bit different, and you're going to have to move away from it. See? And then you'll watch everything I said come to pass. And then you'll find your way to talk. See? When you first move into the spiritual dimension, you are voiceless. You are not familiar with it. It is connected intimately to physical and social reality, but it doesn't work like physical and social reality. See? In our powerful prayer, we can use the Gospels and then contrast it with the social alienation, okay, that we live in. Because we always live in a combination of unity with God and with our neighbor, and alienated from both of them, simul justus et peccatus, simultaneously justified and alienated at the same time. That's what we do. And so I began to think from this, what if all these stories See? What if they were all about teaching us how to touch spirit and release spirit in human life? See? And that they all had instructions built into them. And the interaction, these lightning fast interactions, see? The reason you can't get them on first hearing is that you have to ponder, you have to go deeper. Our consciousness is collapsed into one level where more than we know. The stories try to tell us this more than we know, but in order to get at it, we have to pay close attention to the stories. In the synoptics, the key parable, it's so key that in Mark's gospel he said, if you don't get this one, how will you get the rest? Okay? If you don't get this one, how will you get the rest? It is about consciousness, and it is about consciousness in action. Okay? And it's the sower and the seed. But if we continue it in Luke's gospel, Luke tells you how to do it. He has instructions on how to get to the wisdom, how to let your own consciousness be informed by the consciousness of the story. And he starts out, of course, with the 3 soils that don't work, that don't know how to receive the word. One soil is not really a soil, it's thrown by the side of the road, and the birds of the air come and take it away. He explains that this Satan has taken it right out of your heart. But the birds of the air in spiritual teaching is the fluttering of attention. Attention flutters. See? If you can't hold attention into the stories, you're not going to hear the word. You're not going to incarnate the word. Attention flutters like that. The Buddhists call the mind a drunken monkey. Teresa of Avila called it a bucking horse. You have to pay attention to the text, close attention to the text. See? Otherwise, the birds of the air will take it away. You heard it, but the birds of the air took it away. The failure to focus. A second failure is you take it in and you're overjoyed by it, but then the sun comes out and it withers it instantly because it has no depth. You didn't go deep enough with it. Okay? The third one is other things are growing. The seed of the gospel is not the only thing growing in our lives, and they probably will be competitive, and one will kill the other. Thorns have a way of winning over what is growing seed. So you have to learn processes of integration. But in the last line, Luke gives us the method. He says, for those who bear 100-fold, they hear the word of God and they hold it fast. That's what we want to try to do. You have to hold it fast. You can't let the birds of the air take it away. You got to pay attention to the story. Before I got into doing it this way, I used to tell midrash on gospel texts. See? Because I instinctively felt that it's so hard to get straight. Why don't I just give the characters more motive? Why don't I just take the plot and elongate it? See? Why don't I just pull it apart? See? In the gospel text we read, John turned to report in Luke, he says, Master, we saw a man casting out demons in your name. We tried to stop him because he's not one of our company. Jesus said, do not stop him. If he's not against you, he's for you. Look at how fast. See? Well, let's pull it apart. Let's add to it. See? Let's characterize the disciples more. So I started telling a lot of midrash, but then I went back to this because I felt it's in holding something fast. See? We saw a man casting out demons in your name. Notice what they didn't see. They didn't see the one from whom the demons were cast out. They saw the one who was doing it. They missed the liberation of the human. Instead, they found a competitor to try to kill. Okay. Now, thank God this is a first century text, has nothing to say to us today. This man was doing this in Jesus' name, and they tried to stop him. They couldn't stop him, so that's why they're telling Jesus. Because if he was doing it in Jesus' name, Jesus will stop him. They tried to, they couldn't. Why? Because he was not one of our company. We were getting nothing out of this something good was happening and we were getting nothing out of it. We were not benefiting one bit from this. There's only one possible response. Stop it. Our group is not benefiting. Stop it. Okay. Jesus says, don't stop him. Jesus in the Gospels as a character is not Carl Rogers. You know, it's not non-directive counseling. You know, it's not patient-centered. You know, don't do it. If he's not against you, he's for you. But what are you for? And what do you have to do to find out what you're for? You have to ponder. See? Holding something fast, staying with it, focusing on it, see? Considering it in your mind, holding it there, it will open up the mind into the level of spirit. Even when a mind is heavily addicted into just physical, social, and then mental reality, it will open to another level if you can hold it fast. Where do you have to hold it, St. Luke says? You have to hold it in a good and generous heart. This is a hard place to find. We oftentimes hold gospel texts in our conflicted mind, or in our vaulting ambitions, or in our panicky fears for our own vulnerability. They live in those places, and we try to let them soothe us and heal us. But that is not where they are aimed. They're aimed exactly where Gabriel aimed his words. They're aimed at a spiritual center that is good. That's what St. Matthew thinks. He said, you are the light. You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hid. But what do you do with the light? You put a bushel basket over it? Or do you put it on a lampstand where it gives light to all in the house? So let it be with you. Let your light shine before people so they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. See, they will see your goodness. But that's not what they will see. They will give glory to the source of goodness. There's a place in the human person where whatever good we do is a reflection of a source of goodness. We are connected to this place. A man came up to Jesus and said, "Teacher, what good must I do to possess everlasting life?" Jesus said to him, "Good? Why do you ask me about what is good? There's one who's good." Okay. In the spiritual teachings of the gospel, connecting good with the ego is a bad move. Goodness comes from one source. If goodness flows through you, it's because your heart, the spiritual center of who you are, is connected to the deeper source, and you are opening to it, and it is flowing through you and moving through you like a grace, like a rhythm, like an energy. And goodness is coming out into the manifest world, into the social, physical dimensions from this deeper spiritual dimension. So where you have to hold this text is in a good heart. And this good spiritual center is also extraordinarily generous because the divine source flows through it, and God is always ecstatic. The divine always goes out of itself. And so it will go out of you, see, in a way that doesn't exhaust you, in a way that fills you up. See. You will work out of fullness. So you have to hold these things fast, and you have to put them in a place in you and hold them in a place that's good and generous. Okay? Don't hold it in the place of alienation. Don't hold it in your self-hatred. Okay? Don't hold it in your tenuousness. Don't hold it in your timidity. Hold it in the place where goodness and generosity mingle to become a flow into the outer world. That's where you have to hold the text. See? And that's against the second soil that hears the word with joy but doesn't go deep. And so persecution comes, it withers. The difficulties of life comes, it withers. And so this is a process of spiritual development through the gospel text. It goes deeper. And with patient endurance, the two worst words in the English language, patience and endurance, because it is one thing to realize spiritual truth, it's another thing to embody it. It's a terrible process of repentance, endless repentance. In order to do it, you have to be incredibly patient with yourself, and you have to endure. And if you do it, Luke says, you will bear fruit. Those are Luke's instructions on how to read the gospel. Hold it fast in a good and generous heart, and through patient endurance you will bear fruit. Don't you hate it in the Gospels? The Gospels mainly use imagery. We as a culture, I think, in the Western Hemisphere, we use more analytic language, I think, for the most part. But when you get to the punchline, you'll bear fruit. Thank you for the image. What is the fruit? Okay. Denise Levertov wrote a poem, and it's called What the Fig Tree Said. And this is the fig tree that Jesus cursed. You know, so the fig tree gets to talk about why he was cursed and talks about the embarrassment. This is from Mark's gospel, talks about the embarrassment of the disciples, that Jesus cursed this fig tree, even though it wasn't seasoned to bear figs. Boom, he cursed it, you know, because the natural rhythms of the season mean nothing. The moment of bearing fruit is the moment you hear the word. See, it isn't correlated to natural rhythms. You can hear it at 96, the second before you die, and that's the moment you bear fruit. You can hear it when you're 5 years old, and that's the moment you bear fruit. The natural seasons don't mean anything. It didn't bear fruit, so the fig tree gets a chance to tell the disciples, who are all in a quandary about this, because the poet understands that the disciples don't get it. And the reason the disciples don't get it in the Gospels is so that we can watch them not get it. And watching them not get it, we can begin to get it. Okay? So the poet says, look at them, they think he has done this unjustly to me. They don't understand that they could have ripened in his presence. They could have given gifts of understanding and compassion. He said, but worst of all, because they failed to respond, they left undeveloped gifts unimagined. Okay? That's what the fruit is. The fruit is gifts unimagined. And the reason in spiritual teaching they're unimagined is when you're in darkness, you don't know the light. Until you engage the process. Once you engage the process, things come about which you thought could never, ever, 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 ever have come about. Okay. The mind loves impossibility. It creates impossibility at every stage, at every moment. It knows we cannot more than it knows we can. That's why what the angel says to Mary after he instructs her on what is going to happen, he says, don't you understand? Nothing is impossible with God. Don't you get that? And of course, she doesn't. Because nobody gets it. The only ones who get it are the ones who are living it. Until we begin to live it, we won't get most of what the Gospels have to say. The corresponding imagination of the disciple to the imagination of the texts is absolute. So that's how I got myself into this. Okay. I started out telling stories and then got embarrassed by the fact that every time I would tell stories from other spiritual traditions or stories from Christian traditions, and they'd say, tell a gospel, or I'd tell stories from Genesis, I'd tell Elias stories, tell the Joseph stories, tell those great stories from the Hebrew Scriptures. They say, tell a gospel. So I go, it happens too fast. If I tell it straight, it happens too fast. The listener doesn't get a chance. And I have to work very hard as a teller even to get close to what is happening, say, for long periods of time. I said, why are they built like this? Okay? And I said, I was working, as I said, with Zachary and Mary and Gabriel. I began to think, these are examples of higher wisdom, and these dialogue exchanges are very difficult to get. And The only way Mary goes beyond Zachary is she ponders. We've got to take a different attitude toward these things. Okay? These texts are meant to continually open the one who ponders them into the spiritual dimension of life, which is always present, which is always active, and always elusive. Always just on the edge of consciousness, what James called the difference between focal consciousness and fringe consciousness. They're always on fringe consciousness, and pulling fringe consciousness into focus is really hard to do. Okay. That's the first part of spiritual wisdom, the Gospels. Let me stop there, and let's just turn to your neighbor who won't bite. I've been told that in good authority. Turn to your neighbor who won't bite, and what do you hear in this stuff that interests you?
Okay, Kathy, Spiritual Wisdom of the Gospel, Part 1 by John Shea. Anything you'd like to ponder on?
I loved John Shea's way about him. During this session, it was held in Bath. He walked up and down as he was talking. He wasn't one of these people that just stood in front of you and spouted out. He was really alive. And when he said nothing is impossible to God, you don't just get it. You've got to live it to be able to get it. In other words, you can't just hear it and know it. And I really held that. And when he talked about Mary pondering things in her heart, after this session, I found that I was pondering a lot of things that was said during that, because he spoke about Mary being full of grace and how wonderful it was that Our Lady could accept someone saying to her, "You're full of grace," because John Shea walked up and down the room and was pointing at all different people at times as he passed them, and pointed his finger at them and said, "You're full of grace, but you don't know it." And after that session, I really pondered that. Full of grace, but I don't know it.
Thanks, Kath. Thanks for taking the time to listen to this episode. If you would like to help spread the spiritual wisdom of the Gospels, then there's two very simple ways you can help. First, share this episode with a family member or a friend. And second, subscribe to Agape Ministries podcasts. So, tune in next week to hear part 2 of John Shea's teaching on the spiritual wisdom of the Gospels. Until then, keep safe and have a blessed life.